we sustain this as a government?
I think there are several rules. Let me go back a bit. Even if you say, I think part of the mandate we have is to do some sort of sensitization that explains what borrowing is about. Because really, as individuals, maybe we take loans to buy vehicles because we can't wait for 3 years to save in bits so that we can buy those capital items. So essentially, that's what government is doing. So borrowing is not negative, it's not bad, but you have to manage it properly. Yeah. Yes, so we won't take that away. If we're looking at concerns about debt, the facts, the records show that debt has been growing, but debt is not growing in isolation of regulations and practices. Okay, so if you look at the annual budget, so there are controls around it. The Debt Management Office or the Federal Ministry of Finance can decide we want to borrow X amount on our own. Okay, so the Fiscal Responsibility Act, for instance, is the maximum deficit you can have in your budget is 3%. Okay, that means the National Assembly, we can't have a budget where the deficit is more than 3%, in which case we won't be borrowing more than 3% to finance a budget. So that's one rule. But the Fiscal Responsibility Act in other parts has several rules around borrowing. So also does the DMO Act. So there are controls around borrowing. And you are right, the minister at the launch of the 2018-2020 medium-term expenditure framework, I think the figures were there, and that was, I think, one of those areas that people mix. The targets are there. This is the GDP growth rate we want to achieve. This is the inflation rate we want to achieve. These are projected revenues. These are the projects, the capital expenditure recurrent. So that gap is there. The determination of what to borrow is transparent.
So now that the federal government projects that we will be spending more, about 7.9 trillion next year, that's of course 500 billion, more. What's the side effect of this?
Side effect, I think we should look at two ways. One of the things the present administration has done rather aggressively, I should say, which is good, is try to collect more revenues that rightly belong to the government. Remember what I said, in the budget you have one part that is revenue, then you have expenses. So if the revenues are always short of the expenditure, there's a gap, and that gap is what the deficit is. So while we are managing public debt, the current administration has put in place several measures to increase revenues. So the first is the TSA. I think sometimes we don't know that TSA was not only about centralizing government revenue, it gave the government a full picture of what the revenue generating agencies are receiving, and try to match that. Really, what should your expenditure be? So one is, it gives transparency, and following from that, a guideline was issued to those agencies that generate revenue to say these are your allowable expenses. And based on an audit that was done of them, a number of them were asked to refund monies, meaning really you shouldn't have spent all this money, or you have a surplus sitting. In the past, the strategy was to try and get them to remit 20%. But in looking at the books, there's really more than 20%. So TSA has brought all of those into the fore. And those guidelines simply mean, yes, you may generate trillions of revenues, but it doesn't mean you should spend all of it. These are your allowable expenditure, and that surplus comes to the Federation, comes into the budget, which we never used to see, or saw very little, very, very little if you look at them. And we have many revenue generating agencies. So that's one. The second part is so we're talking about policies to increase revenue. Duty waivers, the several waivers that pioneer status that the government had been issuing. When we issue those waivers, we're actually waiving revenues. Yes. Okay, so that process has been streamlined now because there were abuses in the past. That meant we were denying the government of revenue. So that process has been streamlined. A tax committee was set up, and they came up with a recommendation which has been adopted, so that it is clear that you have to really deserve it to receive that waiver. So more revenue should come to government. Third component, which is recently a lot in the public domain, is the voluntary assets and income declaration scheme introduced by the government, which the acting president launched. If we look at that, it speaks to why we have a low revenue to GDP ratio. Because we have that large informal sector, some you can say is even informal because some are professionals who don't pay taxes, either because they don't want to or it's cumbersome, whatever. So that initiative is meant to enable you generate more revenues.
So the launch of the V8s, really, will it help to jack up the revenue profile?
It will, it will. It will.
But there are conditions, right? Because we've seen a lot of ideas like this launched, you know, of course, bright ideas, but in the long run, one or two things, either mismanagement or, you know, lack of good surveillance on the entire process, you know, just, you know, mask the whole process.
I think those are, maybe what you're giving are useful suggestions, but one of the strategies put in place, unlike where you have a launch of a program and that's the end of it, we all come right about it. With this program, there are foot soldiers that have been trained. They were recruited under N-Power, they applied and they were trained. So they do the door-to-door marketing so that people are not aware and they sort of drum it into people's ears. This has to be done. And if I may quote my Honorable Minister, Nigeria has signed some agreements that enables it with other countries, enables it to access information, just like those other countries can access information. So while you may declare only your salary, you actually may have properties that are generating revenues and other assets that are generating revenues. In other countries, as you know, people pay tax on all of those items. Okay, so most of our tax revenues have come from payee and corporate income tax, whereas there's a lot more and the informal sector is large. Okay, so what I'm saying, there are foot soldiers that are going about, and I know that from 2 or 3 weeks ago, every Thursday is now declared.
Yes.
And the states have been involved, yes. So it's not that big project with launch, with form.
So this is all really to guarantee its success?
Yes, yes, yes. So it's gone to the grassroots.
Okay, now the government, of course, is very much in the